Mara stood on the edge of the crystal cliff and watched the 3 moons rise over her homeland. She was an elf with silver hair that fell down to her waist, and her eyes were the color of deep green forests. Her people called her wild and dangerous because she was different from all the other elves. While they lived in floating cities high in the sky and studied magic in great halls, Mara chose to live alone in the mountains with her dragons. The 3 dragons were her family. Zeph was the largest and oldest, with scales that looked like deep blue sapphires. His eyes were ancient and wise, and he had been with Mara for 15 years. Ember was the youngest, only 5 years old in dragon years, with golden scales that shimmered like fire in the sunlight. Her wings were still small and not fully grown, but she was brave and always ready for adventure. Stormwind was the middle dragon, gray as storm clouds with white lightning marks across her back. She was fierce and strong, and she had saved Mara's life more than once. Mara loved her dragons more than anything in the world. They were not just animals to her. They were friends, family, and partners. She could feel their thoughts in her mind, and they could feel hers. This was rare magic among elves, a connection that most people thought was impossible. One morning, Mara was cooking breakfast over a small fire when Zeph suddenly lifted his head. His nostrils flared and his body went stiff. Mara felt his worry through their bond. Something was wrong. She stood up and looked at the sky, but at first she saw nothing unusual. Then she heard it, a low rumbling sound that grew louder and louder. A massive ship came through the clouds, and it was not like anything Mara had ever seen before. It was made of metal that looked silver and gray, and it was covered with strange symbols and markings. The ship was so big that it blocked out the sun for a moment. It descended slowly toward the ground, moving with a sound like thunder. Mara's dragons were nervous. Ember moved closer to Mara and pressed against her leg. Stormwind began to growl, a deep rumbling sound that came from deep in her chest. Zeph spread his wings wide, ready to protect them. Mara put her hand on his neck and felt his heartbeat racing with fear. The ship landed on a flat piece of ground about 100 yards away from where Mara and her dragons stood. Smoke poured from the landing engines. A door opened and a metal ramp descended. Then people began to come out. They were humans wearing clothes made of metal and carrying weapons that glowed with energy. They were tall and straight-backed, and they moved with purpose. The leader of the humans walked forward slowly. He wore more decorations on his chest than the others, which meant he was important. His name was Officer Chen, and he had a kind face but tired eyes. He held his hands up to show he was not a threat. Through a device on his uniform, his words were translated into the elf language. Officer Chen spoke to Mara and told her that he came from a place very far away called the Human Alliance. He said that his people lived on many different worlds far beyond Ethoria. He said that something terrible was happening in space, something so dangerous that all the people who lived in the galaxy were in danger. Mara listened carefully to what Officer Chen said. She asked what this danger was. He told her about creatures called the Void Seekers. These creatures were not like anything anyone had ever seen before. They were alive, but they existed in a way that was hard to understand. They lived partially in the normal world and partially in other dimensions. They were very hungry and very destructive. The Void Seekers had already destroyed 3 human worlds. Entire planets with billions of people had been wiped out completely. The creatures moved through space like a plague of locusts, eating everything they found. There was nothing left after they visited a place, only empty darkness and silence. Officer Chen said that the Human Alliance was looking for allies to fight against the Void Seekers. They had heard old stories about the elves and their magic. The stories said that the elves had fought similar creatures long ago and had found a way to defeat them. He asked Mara and her people for help. Mara felt Zeph's fear through their bond. She understood that this was serious. She looked at Officer Chen and asked him if he had proof of what he was saying. He showed her a small device that displayed images. The pictures showed enormous creatures moving through space. They were so big that whole planets looked tiny next to them. The creatures seemed to bend reality around them, creating areas of total darkness and emptiness. Mara knew that Officer Chen was telling the truth. She could feel it. She also knew that this was why she had always felt different from other elves. She had always believed that her dragons and her bond with them meant something special. Now she understood. She had been chosen, or perhaps she had chosen herself, for a greater purpose. She turned to Officer Chen and told him that she would help. She said that she would go with him and find a way to fight the Void Seekers. Officer Chen looked relieved and grateful. He told her that this could be the most important decision of her life, and that it might be very dangerous. Mara looked at her 3 dragons. Zeph nodded his great head slowly. Ember moved closer and rubbed against her arm. Stormwind spread her wings wide in a gesture of agreement. They were ready. They would face this danger together. Officer Chen called the other humans over, and they began to set up a camp near the ship. Mara gathered her few belongings from her mountain home. She had not owned much, just some weapons and clothes and a few books of magic. Within a few hours, she was ready to leave. As the sun set, Mara stood on the cliff one last time and looked at her homeland. She knew that her life would never be the same after this night. She was leaving behind everything she had known to fight a battle that most elves did not even believe in. But she was not afraid. She had her dragons with her, and that was enough. The next morning, Mara, her 3 dragons, and Officer Chen's team climbed aboard the great silver ship. As it lifted off the ground and climbed higher into the sky, Mara watched Ethoria grow smaller below them. She felt Zeph's calm strength in her mind, and she knew that no matter what was coming, they would face it together. Inside the human ship, everything was strange and wonderful to Mara. The floors were smooth and clean, made of materials that she did not recognize. The walls glowed with soft light that came from nowhere that she could see. Officer Chen told her that this was technology, which was what humans used instead of magic. It was fascinating to her. The dragons were less interested in the technology than Mara was. Ember kept bumping her head into things and wanting to explore every corridor. Stormwind was cautious and stayed close to Mara. Zeph seemed to understand that this was a place of peace and settled himself in a large chamber that Officer Chen showed them. Officer Chen took Mara to a command center where large screens showed maps of space and the movement of different things through the stars. He pointed to a location and said that this was where they were heading. It was called the Archive of Ancient Wisdom, a place where the elves kept their oldest records and magic. Officer Chen said that if there was any information about the Void Seekers or how to defeat them, it would be there. The journey through space took 3 days. During this time, Mara spent many hours talking with Officer Chen. She learned about humans and their world. She learned that humans only lived for about 80 to 100 years, which seemed very short to her. Elves could live for thousands of years. She learned that humans had created their civilization without magic, using only their minds and their hands to build great cities and machines. Officer Chen told her about the wars that humans had fought among themselves. He said that humans had once been divided into many nations that fought each other with weapons and violence. But now they had united into the Human Alliance and most of them worked together. He said that humans learned through suffering and loss and that they became stronger from their struggles. Mara told Officer Chen about the elves. She explained how her people used magic to create their floating cities and how they lived in harmony with nature. She told him about the different families of elves and how they each specialized in different types of magic. She told him about the magical academy where young elves learned to control their powers. Officer Chen asked her why she was different from other elves. He wanted to know why she chose to live alone in the mountains with dragons instead of living in a city. Mara thought about this carefully before she answered. She told him that she had always felt that there was something more to life than studying magic in academies. She said that she felt that her purpose was to do something important, something that no other elf had done before. She told him about the day she first found Zeph. He had been injured and nearly dead, caught in a hunter's trap. Instead of leaving him, she had freed him and cared for him until he was well. The other elves had told her that she was foolish and that dragons were dangerous and wild. But Mara had known that Zeph was intelligent and kind, and that he deserved a chance at life. When Zeph was strong enough, he had stayed with her instead of flying away. Mara realized then that they had formed a special bond through trust and care, not through domination or force. Years later, she had found Stormwind and then Ember, and each time the bond had been the same. They chose to be together because they loved each other. Officer Chen listened to her story with great interest. He told her that humans had a saying about this kind of love and loyalty. He said that the bond between Mara and her dragons was precious and rare, and that it would be important in the battles to come. On the 3rd day, the ship arrived at the location where the Archive of Ancient Wisdom was hidden. It was built inside a mountain on a small moon that orbited a large planet. When they landed, Mara, her dragons, and Officer Chen with a few of his soldiers prepared to explore the archive. The entrance was carved from stone that was white and smooth, and it had symbols written all over it. Mara could read the symbols because they were the ancient language of the elves. She traced her fingers across them and felt the magic that had been placed there to protect the archive. These symbols were thousands of years old, from a time when elves were much more powerful than they were now. Mara whispered some words of magic, and the stone doors slowly began to open. A cool breeze blew out from the darkness within, carrying the smell of stone and ancient dust. The entrance was wide enough for the dragons to walk through, though they had to duck their heads. Inside, the archive was vast and amazing. There were shelves that went up so high that Mara could not see the top. They were filled with books and scrolls and tablets made of crystal that seemed to glow from within. The air was cool and dry, which had preserved everything perfectly for thousands of years. Officer Chen and his soldiers looked around in wonder. He told Mara that this place was beyond anything the humans had ever imagined. He said that this was proof that the elves had a history far more advanced than anyone had believed. Mara walked deeper into the archive, with her dragons following close behind. She was searching for records about the Void Seekers and the ancient war that had been fought against them. She knew that the information she was looking for would be in the oldest section of the archive, in a place that only the highest elves were supposed to know about. As she walked, she began to feel a strange presence. It was like something was watching her from the shadows. Stormwind growled softly and Zeph's muscles grew tense. Mara realized that they were not alone in the archive. Something else was here. Something that had been waiting in the darkness for a very long time. Mara's hand went to the sword at her side as she moved deeper into the archive. The presence she felt became stronger and the air grew colder. Zeph moved ahead of her, his head high and alert. Stormwind stayed close to Ember, protecting the young dragon. Officer Chen and his soldiers prepared their weapons, unsure what danger they were facing. Then they entered a great chamber, and everything became clear. The chamber was enormous, with a ceiling so high that it seemed to reach into the stars. On the walls there were paintings and murals that told a story. Mara gasped when she saw them because they showed events from ancient times, events that had been forgotten by her people. The paintings showed a great war between the elves and creatures that looked similar to the Void Seekers. In the images, the creatures were enormous and terrible, with bodies that seemed to exist in multiple places at once. The elves in the paintings were using magic to fight them, sending waves of power and light against the creatures. But the creatures kept coming, kept consuming and destroying. In the center of the chamber, there was a stone table with a book resting on it. The book was made of materials that Mara did not recognize, and it glowed with a faint light. She knew immediately that this was what she had been looking for. This was the record of the ancient war. She approached the book slowly, and as she drew near, words began to appear in the air above it. The words were in the ancient elf language, and they seemed to be reading themselves aloud. Officer Chen's translation device interpreted them into human speech so that he and his soldiers could understand. The book told the story of a time when the Void Seekers had invaded the galaxy thousands of years ago. At that time, the elves had been much more powerful than they were now. They had united with other races to form an alliance, just as humans and elves were now doing. Together, they had fought a long and terrible war against the Void Seekers. The war had lasted for 1,000 years. Many lives had been lost and many worlds had been destroyed. The Void Seekers could not be killed by weapons or magic in the traditional way. They existed partially in normal space and partially in other dimensions, so attacks against them only partially worked. After centuries of struggle, the Elder Elves and the other races had discovered a solution. They learned that the Void Seekers could be sealed away using a very powerful spell, but this spell required a terrible sacrifice. It needed the combined life force of many warriors and mages. Thousands of elves had volunteered to perform this spell, knowing that they would give up their lives to save the galaxy. The spell had worked, and the Void Seekers had been sealed away behind barriers that existed between dimensions. The book said that these barriers would last for thousands of years, but eventually they would weaken. It predicted that one day when the barriers had become weak enough, the Void Seekers would return. Mara read the instructions for the spell that could seal the Void Seekers away again. The spell was written in detail, with every word and every gesture described precisely. But there was a problem. The spell required 3 things that were very difficult to obtain. First, it needed a warrior with a heart that was pure and brave. someone who was willing to face death without fear. Second, it needed dragons with souls that were true and good, creatures that had never been corrupted or broken by cruelty. Third, it needed to be performed in a place where the barriers between worlds were very thin, a location where magic was so strong that it could reach across dimensions. When Mara read these requirements, she understood what she had to do. She was the warrior. Her 3 dragons were the creatures with pure souls. Together they could perform the spell. But she would need to find the location where the barriers were thin. Officer Chen stood beside her and read the requirements as well. He realized what this meant. He told Mara that she could not do this alone, that she would need help and protection. He promised her that the Human Alliance would send soldiers and resources to help her complete this task. Mara looked at her dragons, and through their bond, she felt their resolve. They understood what needed to be done, and they were willing to do it. Zeph stepped forward and placed his great head on the book. Stormwind and Ember did the same. Together the 4 of them made a silent promise. They would find the place where the barriers were thin, and they would seal away the Void Seekers forever. Mara carefully took the ancient book from the stone table. As she lifted it, the room began to tremble slightly. A path appeared on the floor made of glowing stones that showed the way out of the archive. Officer Chen said that this was the archive's way of saying goodbye and wishing them well on their journey. They left the archive and returned to the ship. Mara kept the ancient book with her at all times. She studied it constantly during the journey back to Ethoria. She memorized the spell and understood every detail of what needed to be done. Officer Chen sent messages to the Human Alliance, explaining what they had found and what needed to be done. He requested soldiers, supplies, and weapons. He asked for ships to be sent to Ethoria to help protect the elves if the Void Seekers attacked. The response came back quickly. The Human Alliance was taking this threat very seriously. Ships were being sent to join forces with the elves. Scientists and researchers were studying the information from the ancient archive. There was hope that together, humans and elves could stop the Void Seekers before they could cause any more destruction. When the ship arrived back at Ethoria, Mara was ready. She knew what she had to do, and she was not afraid. She had her dragons, she had Officer Chen and the humans to help her, and she had the knowledge of her ancestors. The time had come to prepare for the final battle. When they returned to Ethoria, Mara knew that she needed help from her own people. She went to the great city of Silvermist, where the elf leaders lived and governed. The city floated high in the sky, held up by ancient magic that had been maintained for tens of thousands of years. Beautiful towers of crystal and silver reached toward the clouds, and gardens of magical plants grew everywhere. The leaders of the elves were surprised and confused when Mara arrived with Officer Chen and a human military contingent. They had not seen Mara in many years because she had chosen to live away from their society. Some of the leaders remembered her as a talented young elf, but they considered her reckless and irresponsible for bonding with dragons. Mara was brought before the Council of Elders, a group of the oldest and wisest elves in the world. They sat on thrones of white stone in a great hall that was open to the sky. The leader of the council was an ancient elf named Theron, who had lived for over 10,000 years. His eyes were kind but sad, and his silver beard reached down to his waist. Mara told them everything that had happened. She explained about the Void Seekers and how they were coming to destroy all life in the galaxy. She told them about the ancient war, and about the spell that their ancestors had used to seal away the darkness. She showed them the ancient book and explained that she had been chosen to perform the spell again. The council members listened carefully, but many of them were skeptical. They did not trust humans, and they did not believe that the danger was as serious as Mara claimed. Some of the younger council members spoke out against her, saying that she was being fooled by the humans. They suggested that this was a trick to gain access to elf magic and elf technology, but Theron listened to everything and believed her. He had lived long enough to know that such threats did exist in the universe. He had read the ancient stories and understood that such dangers could return. He told the other council members that they had to trust Mara and that they had to help her. Theron stood up from his throne, and the other council members fell silent. As the oldest and most respected elf, his words carried great weight. He declared that Ethoria would join with the Human Alliance to fight the Void Seekers. He ordered that all elf soldiers and mages should prepare for war. He asked Mara to work with Officer Chen to plan their defense. With the support of the elf leaders, things moved very quickly. Soldiers began to gather from all across Ethoria. Mages who specialized in different types of magic came together to form fighting units. Supply lines were established to move weapons, food, and healing potions to where they were needed. Officer Chen worked with the elf military leaders to combine human technology with elf magic. The humans had advanced weapons and vehicles, but elf magic could strengthen these things and make them more powerful. Together, they created defenses that were stronger than anything either race could have built alone. Mara spent much of her time preparing for the ritual that would seal away the Void Seekers. She studied the ancient book and practiced the spell with her dragons. The spell was very complex and required perfect timing and coordination between her and Zeph, Stormwind, and Ember. They practiced for hours each day, learning how to channel magic through their bond and direct it precisely where it needed to go. The dragons grew stronger during this time. Ember, who had been just a young dragon, began to mature and show her true power. She could now fly faster and longer than before, and her fire was hot enough to melt stone. Stormwind became even more fierce and confident. Zeph's ancient magic grew deeper and more powerful. News arrived that more human ships were approaching Ethoria. These ships carried additional soldiers, weapons, and supplies. The human alliance was taking this threat very seriously and was sending everything they could to help. The soldiers from different worlds began to arrive in Silver Mist, and the great city became crowded with warriors from many different races. Humans were not the only allies that arrived. There were also beings from other worlds who had heard about the danger. Some were reptilian creatures with scales and horns. Others were insectoid beings with multiple limbs and compound eyes. There were also robotic entities that had been created by ancient technological races. All of them came to help fight the Void Seekers because they knew that if Ethoria fell, their worlds would not be far behind. Officer Chen explained to Mara that the Void Seekers were like a plague of locusts, moving from world to world and consuming everything. They had to be stopped before they could destroy more civilizations. If the seal could be restored, it would buy time for the galaxy to prepare better defenses. Mara felt honored to be working with so many different beings. She realized that this was what her ancestors had done thousands of years ago. They had united different races and worked together to overcome a common enemy. Now Mara was doing the same thing. The location for the ritual had been found. It was a valley on the edge of Ethoria called the Place of Thin Boundaries. Ancient elves had chosen this location thousands of years ago because the barriers between worlds were indeed very thin there. Magic was stronger in this place than almost anywhere else, and it was the perfect location for a spell of such great power. Preparations began to move to this valley. Soldiers arrived to set up defensive positions. Magical circles were drawn on the ground to focus and amplify the spell. Supplies were brought in case the battle lasted a long time. As everything came together, Mara felt a strange sense of calm. She knew that the time of the final confrontation was near. She felt confident because she had her dragons. She had allies from many different worlds, and she had the knowledge and power to perform the ancient spell. The day of the battle arrived with a dark sky that seemed to press down from above. The Void Seekers were visible even from far away, enormous shadows moving through space toward Ethoria. They looked like nothing that anyone had ever seen before, shapes that seemed to exist and not exist at the same time. Where they moved, reality itself seemed to bend and distort. All of the allied forces gathered in and around the valley. Thousands of soldiers stood ready, their weapons charged and prepared. Elf mages formed groups and prepared their most powerful spells. Human soldiers stood in ranks behind advanced weapons that could shoot beams of pure energy. The robotic entities took positions at the highest points to observe and report on enemy movements. Mara stood in the center of the valley with her 3 dragons. Zeph was to her left, Stormwind to her right, and Ember in front of her. They had drawn the magical circles around them, and the air crackled with power. Mara held the ancient book in her hands, and she had memorized every word of the spell. Officer Chen stood nearby with a communication device. He would report to the other commanders and coordinate the defense while Mara performed the ritual. He told her not to worry about the battle, that he and the others would handle it. She just needed to focus on the spell. The first Void Seekers emerged from the darkness of space and began to descend toward Ethoria. They were massive creatures, larger than mountains, with bodies that seemed to be made of pure darkness. As they approached, they began to consume everything in their path. Ships that had been sent to intercept them simply disappeared, eaten by the creatures' vast mouths. But the Allied forces were ready. Lasers and energy weapons fired at the creatures and elf magic crackled through the air. The spells seemed to work better than expected. When magical fire hit the creatures, they shrieked in pain and pieces of them were burned away. The creatures began to retreat, pulling back into space. But there were more of them, many more. Wave after wave of void seekers descended toward Ethoria. The battle raged in the sky above the valley, and the sound of weapons and spells was deafening. But gradually the Allied forces began to gain the upper hand. The combination of human technology and elf magic was proving to be very effective against the creatures. Mara began to chant the ancient words. Her voice was soft at first, but it grew louder and stronger. The dragons joined her, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to touch dimensions beyond the normal world. The magical circles around them began to glow with bright light, and the ground itself began to tremble. The spell was beginning to work. Power flowed from the earth and from the sky. Mara felt the energy building up inside her, and she let it flow through the bond she shared with her dragons. Zeph's ancient power joined with her will. Stormwind's fierce strength added to the magic. Ember's young but pure magic came together with all the rest. The light grew brighter and brighter until it filled the entire valley. Everyone had to shield their eyes from the intensity. The magical circles began to expand, growing larger and larger. The spell was reaching its full power. In the sky, the Void Seekers began to sense that something terrible was happening. They tried to retreat, but they were too slow. The magic from the spell reached out and touched them. They screamed, a sound that was not made with any mouth or voice, but with their very existence being repelled and pushed back. One by one, the creatures were driven back into the darkness. The barriers between worlds became solid again, and the Void Seekers found themselves sealed away behind walls that they could not penetrate. The gateway between their dimension and normal space was closed and locked, but the spell required a price, as it always did. Mara felt her strength being pulled away, being drained into the magic. She understood now what her ancestors had done. They had given their lives to save the galaxy. She looked at her 3 dragons and felt their love for her. Zeph moved closer and pressed his forehead against hers. Through their bond, he told her without words that he was proud of her. Stormwind and Ember did the same, and together the 4 of them poured all of their remaining strength into the spell. As the spell reached its final moment, something unexpected happened. Instead of the magic consuming Mara and her dragons, it began to flow back. The power that had been drawn from the earth and sky returned to them, strengthened and purified by what they had done. Mara felt warmth filling her body, and she realized that they were going to live. The light faded and the spell was complete. Silence fell over the valley. All of the Void Seekers had been sealed away, and the barrier between worlds was strong and solid again. The galaxy was safe. Officer Chen rushed to Mara and caught her as she stumbled. She was exhausted but alive. The dragons were also tired but unharmed. Around them, all of the Allied soldiers began to cheer. They had won. Against all odds, they had stopped the darkness and saved their worlds. As the sun rose over Ethoria, Mara stood with her dragons and looked at Officer Chen. She knew that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a wild elf living alone in the mountains. She was a hero and a savior of worlds. But more importantly, she had her dragons by her side, and she had friends from many different races who shared her values and her courage. The story of Mara and her dragons would be told for generations to come. In time, it would become a legend, a story of hope and friendship that had saved the galaxy from destruction. And Mara would spend her long elf life working with her allies to make sure that such darkness never returned to threaten the worlds of peace and light that they had fought so hard to protect.